fuck is going on? Okay. Let's turn something on. Where's my goddamn soundboard?
People.
$5.
Oh.
Hey folks, welcome to the Dark Horse Podcast. This
wonder if
is
it
the
should be
Q&A with Yuri Deigin, who many of you,
Probably a
hopefully
little
most of
quiet,
you,
right?
have seen on my original
Hold on
discussion
now.
with him about the lab leak hypothesis for the origin of SARS-CoV-2, the cause of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our plan here is to have you give us questions. Super chat questions will be prioritized. We're looking for high quality questions and questions only related to the topic in our discussion of the lab leak hypothesis. So you can ask us about other things mentioned there, but no general questions if you would. Yuri, welcome to the Dark Horse Podcast again.
Thanks for having me again. It's a pleasure.
A lot of people were fascinated by our discussion, and I think it is having an effect in the world. People are waking up to the idea that they cannot just simply dismiss this hypothesis, no matter how much that is their desire.
It's great. Although, I mean, at this point, there seems to be so many other things going on in the world that I think it's kind of fading on people's immediate interests.
Yeah, I would agree with that. On the other hand, I would say I don't think the two are unrelated. And because of that, we cannot afford to focus in one place and ignore the other. So certainly here in the U.S., we are seeing unrest of a kind that is, I think, in almost every way unprecedented. And that unrest is obviously related to the lockdown in the sense that it changed people's obligations in the world. It caused them to be more frustrated as the economy began to take its descent. And so to the extent that that unrest of this scale can happen in a country that is among the most stable in the world, to the extent that that can be affected by a pandemic that could emerge at any time, understanding what the roots of that pandemic are is paramount. We can't afford to have something throw us into chaos if that something is preventable. So in any case, I do think you're right. People are much more focused on other topics, but I don't really see it as other topics.
Yeah, it's definitely all interconnected.
It is that. All right, so how about we start with a couple of questions that came in during the initial premiere of our original discussion. The first one is not about the coronavirus per se, but it is this. Am I right that the glitchy computers conspiracy from your talk with Yuri Deigin was a joke? If not, how do you assess the probability that it wasn't a coincidence? Thanks. You want to start with that?
Oh man, I mean, I think it's mostly a coincidence because it hasn't really occurred, and I just, as soon as I start having problems, completely wiped out the system and restored for backup. And the fact that it hasn't happened since, at least to me, probably just a coincidence. The fact that it happened with some other people who were also involved with questioning the lab leak hypothesis, it could also be a coincidence. But I think we're like half jokingly discuss it and put out feelers into the ether to see if there are other people experiencing something like this. And, as we I think alluded to originally, if we hear about more people having some kind of technical issues or any other kind of weird things happening in their life, that could start being a pattern. But at this point,
I'm going to take a slightly different tack on this question. I think one has to behave as if it is a coincidence, and it is almost impossible to rule that out unless
How about I just use a special
somebody sends you an unambiguous message. But you had a malware problem that took.
Oh yeah, and
Go ahead.
Sorry, I did start receiving a lot of like weird, phishing emails. Almost much higher number of them. Probably started like a couple months back. I never opened them, so I don't know if that could be related or not.
Sure.
So it's the one data point.
Well, there's the possibility that people were eagerly trying to figure out what was on your machine. There's a possibility that they were trying to spook you. And there's a possibility that it was unrelated and just a feature of the world as it exists. But I would say we had collapses of our system here related to the podcast that were very unusual at a technical level. In other words, we had collapses that continued to plague us even though we had literally swapped out every component that could conceivably cause it. So that's an unusual pattern when one is troubleshooting. Does it mean anything? I don't know. I do know that the timing was conspicuous, but of course coincidences happen of their own accord. And what I would say is, if you're going to find yourself in a realm like this, where you have, essentially some huge range of actors has an interest in this story. People want to blame China. China doesn't want to be blamed. Lots of people have turned this into a political football, and they have interest in how it is understood. And so there's no shortage of people who might want to dissuade people like you and me who won't look away from the story. But one can't assume that every hiccup is that. And in fact, we had a hiccup at the end of our conversation, which I think you and I both read as very unlikely to mean anything. Why would you disrupt the end of a stream? But I've had streams disrupted at moments that were very conspicuous before, and it started to happen. Had one, the most amazing set of collapses we had was right after I first started talking about your Medium piece and its implications. So I don't know what to make of all this. Again, I think one has to work from the assumption that this is an organic problem in a highly complex technological world in which lots of pieces that are made by different people are interfacing together. That's a bug-prone world. But there's also
I love Bret. He's such a nice dude.
a lot
He's
that's
like,
conspicuous about
he's
the
really
pattern. And
careful
because we
with
all
how he
have a
talks.
history of facing
He's awesome.
technical glitches in our computing lives, when something really out of the ordinary happens, it does have a different feel. Yep. All right.
I guess we can leave it at that.
Yep, let's leave it at that. The next question is,
I mean,
if
this
the
wasn't
virus
going
had escaped from her
anywhere,
lab,
But
why would
in any
Xi
case, that was a
Zhengli release
really
the
nice, really
sequence
balanced,
for
really,
RATG13 and place more suspicion on her lab?
considering
And then
I
the
thought
second
you
part of the
said
question
okay.
is, how do we explain
Bret is pretty good at
the samples and original
about what he's saying.
patients with exposure at the Wuhan seafood market?
Okay.
You're
probably in the best position to answer this, Yuri.
Well, let's try. Let's just address the first point first. I wasn't very clear on the second one. Let's address the first one. So why would Xi Jinping kind of release
Hi, Ryzen.
the RATG sequence rather than just, I guess, keep being silent? Well, the first and foremost, she already released part of that sequence back in 2016, I guess. I mean, she collected it in 2013, but they had a publication in 2016 where they released a fragment of that sequence to GeneBank. And so actually by the time Xi Jinping released it in 2020, the full sequence, the full genome, there were already groups, I think with a preprint or just maybe some
By the way,
comments
I don't really know what the balance
virology
of the sound is.
blog somewhere
If you're not hearing
who
me,
identified that very fragment and they were essentially kind of on
hearing too little of
the
something,
trail of Xi Jinping saying this is the
too much of
closest
something.
relative of SARS-2 that we were able to find using, the blasting of genomic sequences in the database. So unless she kind of released the full, she would be
Yuri
made
himself
to release
is quite
the
low.
full genome anyway.
It's kind
So
of how
I think it's much better for her to do it proactively rather than wait
that up a little bit.
for some uncomfortable questions. And secondly, she could of course release the sequence that she most would be most favorable with. Again, I'm not saying she's trying to doctor it in any way, but it's a possibility. So maybe she could have been trying to divert the attention of the people to
psychic vampire.
from the maybe a closer sequence they have in their possession by using the fragment that she already released into the GeneBank years ago, and then building around it with a 4% difference from the current SARS-2 genome. But I mean, it's not like she had an option of just saying silence precisely because she already made known that they had the closest fragment in their possession.
Yeah, I agree with this analysis. She didn't have a choice. That it was if this had been an escape from her lab and she is aware of that fact, that's a big if. But if
that
that's what
tell
happened,
you much, doesn't it, right?
And for whatever reason,
No, I didn't.
she was hoping that would not be the conclusion of the scientific community.
No,
she had very little
not a
choice
fan of
but
gender politics.
to release the sequence. And as we talked about in our earlier discussion, there's also the question about, is there something about the 4991 strain that is connected to something in possibly the database that was deleted that was very conspicuous, and by releasing it as if it was a separate strain, that it might lead people in a different direction. Again, this is speculative. We're not saying this did happen. We're not saying we know, but we're saying this is not behavior that suggests that this person is necessarily trying to shed light on what happened. If, let's take the possibility that the Chinese government has exerted pressure and said, we don't want this understood. It could be that she's doing this under duress. So there are lots of possibilities. But I don't see anything exonerating in her releasing that sequence.
Right, and also I think she released it after there was this Indian preprint that alleged some small fragments from the HIV genome being present in SARS-2, and so maybe that was her kind of reaction to show that no, actually those fragments were present in the ancestral strain or like the close relative, and so she had to release that ancestral strain to kind of add evidence to her claims. And she seemed very upset with that Indian preprint. She, I think, in WeChat or somewhere she said that she hopes those scientists close their stinking mouths or something like that, relating to that very preprint. And so that could be another reason why she decided to
I'm
release
against
it.
gender politics.
And also, it does seem that
that's one
there is, maybe if not panic, but definitely some duress, as you said, that her team is under, and I'm sure the whole Institute of Virology is under, and they're getting some, external control from the military imposed on them from Beijing. The Major General Chen, I think, she overtook leadership in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And so it's not necessarily like a cold, calculated move. It could be, again, just something that they decided to do to exonerate themselves in the eyes of whoever, maybe their immediate, the imposed leadership from Beijing. They decided to show that it's not them. Finally, there is another kind of line of thinking, and this, I agree, is a bit of a more conspiratorial idea that maybe this is her kind of signaling about some other lab, whereas her phrasing is a little bit interesting, is that she says she swears on her life that it didn't come from her lab. So this kind of leaves open the possibility that it could have come from some other lab, and she might know, but she's not, in a position to fully say this. Ooh. And by releasing the sequence, she's maybe, I don't know, giving some hints as to kind of you guys figure out exactly where this could have come from.
Yes, okay. It would be wonderful if that's a possibility. It would be wonderful if there was some mechanism, as we talked about in our earlier discussion, if there was some mechanism that allowed people to securely offer information that would allow us to put together the origin story of this virus.
About people you love.
Right.
So let me ask you this, since go ahead.
Yeah. Just one final point. Sorry, I keep getting back to this. Is it's also interesting what they didn't say. And what they didn't say is the whole backstory of the pneumonia in the mine in Yunnan, in Mojiang, where they originally collected this RATG13 strain. And they still, I don't think they, to date, ever addressed this. And there was this outbreak of 6 miners who got pneumonia, after which Xi Jinping was called to the mine and did collect the sample. And I don't think nobody from Wuhan still, to this day, ever addressed this story. And we know that they're leading kind of SARS guy, the academician, Jean, I keep butchering his name, but he's like the Mr. SARS guy. He was in charge, essentially, of this pneumonia investigation. He actually ordered the miner samples checked for SARS antibodies back in 2013. And I think they actually did the work in the Wuhan Institute. And Xi Jinping was definitely in the loop of this work. And since this is still not mentioned to this day officially in the Chinese press or in any of the scientific publications, it's definitely still a big question mark. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah, as you pointed out in our last discussion, the place to pick up the trail would be those samples if we had access to them.
Yeah.
So anyway, if the world is trying to figure out what to do next, that would be a good bet in order to shed more light on the story. You raised the issue of the claim that there are sequences from HIV in SARS-CoV-2. And I remember when I first saw that claim, I thought, no way. And then I saw some stuff that suggested to me, actually, there might be. And my first reaction was, wow, that would be open and shut case if there were. And then I remember looking into it and realizing that it wasn't. The reason it would be an open and shut case, I thought, was that coronaviruses and retroviruses are so distantly related, I mean, if related at all, that the transmission of sequences from one group to the other would likely have been accomplished technologically. But when I looked into that claim, I don't exactly remember what the evidence was, but actually I got the sense that it would not be that surprising, and I abandoned that line of thinking. Do you have thoughts or information on the possibility of HIV sequences showing up in SARS-CoV-2?
Right. I pretty much dismissed it along with everybody else when it was, once it was analyzed that those actual sequences, the fragments, are just very short fragments, and it could have been just essentially a coincidence that, pretty much any short enough strain of letters showing up in any other genome by pure coincidence. But I think this storyline was picked up again by Luc Montagnier, the French Nobel Prize-winning scientist, and he still continues kind of, promoting this idea, although the scientific mainstream is even farther from this line of reasoning as it is from a general lab leak hypothesis. But I have to be honest, I didn't really, get back into this, or I didn't read his preprint, although he has published a preprint where they seem to, provide more evidence of some HIV-related genetic fragments in SARS-CoV-2.
Yeah, I recall looking into his work initially. His credential is obviously based on such powerful prior work that it's very hard to ignore his belief that this contains HIV fragments and that essentially is a smoking gun. But I remember looking into it, and mechanistically I was just not compelled that the story added up. But certainly on the list of hypotheses, I believe it on... we have to analyze it carefully and figure out whether or not what is being claimed is sufficiently improbable that it implies a special origin explanation. All right. So let's see.
There was a second part to that question.
Oh yeah.
The Hunan seafood market.
Yes.
I'm not sure what was being asked, but maybe I think at this point we can pretty safely rule out the Hunan seafood market as the source of the outbreak, as has been ruled out by even the mainstream China. That's their official position now, that the virus came into the market before it came out of the market, to use their quote. Precisely because even initially there's this Lancet publication analyzing the first patients, and the first, I think, 3 of the 4 patients that were treated in the hospital with the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus, 3 of the 4 didn't have exposure to the Hunan seafood market. And that was kind of the early sign that it's probably not the source of the outbreak. And later on, when they analyzed samples from that market, although there's very interestingly, not very many samples were collected before the market was completely sanitized and scrubbed. But even still, there weren't any animal samples of anything close to the SARS-CoV-2, just kind of human samples, which almost certainly were just contaminated of people who had SARS-CoV-2 already, picked it out somewhere else outside of the market and brought it in.
Yeah.
So I think at this point, we could just rule out the market as a source.
We could rule out the market as a source. What we can say in retrospect is that the evidence for the market is circumstantial evidence, basically, of proximity, that there's no evidence of the virus in animals in the market, and there's evidence of people who had no connection to the market who were sick in the first round, and so that effectively takes it to an extremely low probability. The interesting thing, though, is that in the announcement that China had revised its explanation and was no longer it no longer believed that the Wuhan seafood market was the source, it also dismissed the laboratory origin hypothesis. So it sort of had this poison pill aspect to it, in which they were almost like negotiating with the logic. We'll grant you that you're right, that the Wuhan seafood market is not involved, but the lab is also not involved, with no compelling evidence of why we should assume that. Now, let me ask you, as long as we're here, there are a couple of pieces of analysis floating around about behavior in and around the Wuhan Virology Institute, Wuhan Institute of Virology, and hospitals in Wuhan, China, where there is anomalous behavior detected. And the claim is that these things imply that there was awareness of an accident in the case of the Virology Institute, and that there was awareness, or that there was a medically anomalous influx of patients into the hospital. I guess this would have been October. Is that right? Do you have any thoughts about whether that those pieces of analysis actually imply anything? Have you looked at them?
I have. I'm sure as everybody, just once the news hits, I looked at the information. I think you're referring to two kind of different sets of analysis. First being the analysis of cellular signal around the Wuhan lab that reported some kind of blackout period in October, I think early October.
So when you say cellular, you mean cellular phone activity?
Right, right, exactly. Yes, cellular phone activity that seems, it's a, I guess, publicly collected database, like, anonymized, which is used by all sorts of commercial intelligence providers to analyze trends of potential consumers. So basically, a lot of companies are collecting all the cellular data of pretty much everybody. This data can be available to these providers who can mine it. Somebody mined that data and saw that at the time of, early October, there was a sudden drop in the usual number of cell phones and cell phone traffic associated with the area of the Wuhan Institute's BSL-4 facility. And on the basis of this, they kind of hypothesized that maybe this signifies some kind of accidents, some kind of shutdown of the area. And also, they seem to implicate there was some kind of traffic shutdown, because not only the lab itself, but the area around it, the traffic around, like the vehicular traffic with cell phones, I guess, they seem to imply has greatly diminished for a period of, I guess, 2 weeks or something. I'm saying all this from memory. It's been a while since I looked. I might be a little bit off on some of the data points. So that was one thing, and it was released back in 2 months ago. And since then, nobody really had any follow-up, so it kind of died down. There was no follow-up investigation by a regular intelligence agency or anybody else. And then recently, there was another circumstantial evidence of consumer trends released, which was these, first of all, parking lots around hospitals exhibiting many more cars last fall versus the fall the year previously. And secondly, the keyword searches for, I think, diarrhea and fever, if I remember correctly, that kind of spiked in, again, I think it was October or maybe late September, something like that. So they were trying to tie that into the idea that actually the virus circulating in Wuhan or in Hubei province, where Wuhan is, much earlier than it was kind of officially, well, first of all, maybe recognized, and secondly, just maybe realized, maybe, the hospitals or the authorities just didn't realize they had this kind of initial stages of epidemic on their hands.
So,
I mean, it's a valid hypothesis. I don't know how strong it is, because, I mean, generally, I guess, every year we have all sorts of viruses around this time. And whether a spike in keyword searches for diarrhea is indicative of this particular strain, or kind of an ancestral strain of SARS-2 being present in the population, that I don't know whether it's a valid kind of conjecture or connection of the two. Precisely because, I mean, even in Russia, there was a spike in pneumonias back in November, and there's a lot of, or there were at least, I don't know if there's any more, but there were a lot of kind of, again, conjectures that maybe Russia had been exposed to SARS-CoV-2 much previously, and maybe we developed some sort of immunity, and this is one of the kind of popular people's explanation why we're not getting the same level of pandemic back in March as the rest of the world was. The idea was, well, maybe we had it in November, we didn't know this. Of course, then we got the same thing as the rest of the world, maybe just a couple of weeks delayed, and that idea died down.
Yeah. So I had the same thought, which is that in order to assess, especially, no, it's actually true for both the cell phone data and the hospital data. What one wants to do is an analysis of, if you survey an area at random that looks something like the Hubei province, for example, how often do you see something this anomalous, right? In other words, would you see lots of things that were there a virology institute, you might think it was an accident, but there's no virology institute, so you don't notice it. So anyway, I had the same sense that the ice was not very thick with respect to these couple of claims. That said, it could be evidence, and if you found that cell phone traffic dying down in the way that we see it in October around the Wuhan Institute was a very unusual event, then it would be stronger evidence. But at this point, we in the public don't know how common these things are, and so we can't assess these pieces of data.
Right, and another similar piece of data that kind of again went uninvestigated was this leak from U.S. intelligence. Apparently, somewhere in the U.S. intelligence community was
last month,
kind of ringing alarm bells in November that there is already an outbreak in Wuhan, that it's going to be serious, and that they see all sorts of disruptions already in place. And supposedly this was November. And this was published in Washington Post, I think. But then again, it was it never followed up, so we don't know how real that info was, or why did it ultimately get ignored. So, I mean, still a lot of unanswered questions, and maybe at some point these all pieces of the puzzle fit, or maybe it's just kind of like red herrings and some misinterpretation or false leaks that we just kind of have to sift through.
Yep.
Ultimately.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Next question says, suppose we develop a coronavirus vaccine that with minor tweaks could also be effective on bats as well. Thoughts on dispersing in bat populations as an extra buffer? I have some thoughts here as a bat biologist. Do you want to start?
Yeah, if I may let you take that one.
So my first thought is, first of all, as widespread as fear of vaccination is amongst humans, it's even worse in bats. And so my guess is they just won't go along with it. All right. In English, that was a hilariously funny joke. Only worth a chuckle in Russian, I guess. But
no, I fucking laughed. It's
so that's good.
I think the real question here, first of all, the idea that you would have a vaccine in humans that works in bats. It's a question of how you would even establish that. I mean, it's obviously doable, but is it worth the extra effort to figure out whether or not, if let's say that minor tweaks are necessary, that's not a simple matter to figure out what those minor tweaks are, and figuring out how to vaccinate bats and whether it has worked is going to be a long-term project at the very least. And I think the really important issue is the same one that applies generally to this gain-of-function research for the purpose of figuring out how to prevent pandemics, which is if gain-of-function research is more likely to produce a pandemic than it is to give us useful information about how to prevent one, then it's not a good idea. And likewise, attempting to vaccinate bats against viruses that could leap to humans and then could evolve into a pandemic is probably going to create such an increase in the intensity of human-bat contact with exactly the bats that are harboring these viruses that I would say it's probably a losing proposition to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, having some kind of bat vaccination program or even like gene drive in bats to clear them of any sorts of coronaviruses is a very good use of people's money or time. Or yes, and plus might create extra dangers. I think we're just better off leaving the bats alone, both for research purposes and human purposes. And actually, I think Xi Jinping was one of her missions to stop the kind of the barbaric notion of people eating bats, and that was one of her key points in her talk in 2018, in like a TED-like talk she gave in China. And she actually said that this pandemic is a payback for humanity for barbaric practices of imposing or eating wildlife or something, or disturbing wildlife. So in that sense, but I think before we start going vaccinating bats, we have a minor issue of not even having a human vaccine first, and this is desperately needed for our purposes. So let's first get that done. And then, okay,
Yeah, so I agree with you. The human vaccine is obviously the priority. I think in the meantime, if we just ask the bats to social distance, that's probably the best we can do. You know, fly 2 wing lengths apart, that kind of thing. All right, next question. What concerns me most isn't that the experts got it wrong initially. It's how adamant they were that it couldn't be questioned, or that they couldn't be questioned. I absolutely agree with this. Experts they have to have leeway to get things wrong. And frankly, even the fact of certainty is an indicator that something has gone wrong. There was such a strong desire to shut down the lab leak hypothesis to begin with that we weren't having a scientific discussion. We were having a discussion with scientists that was not scientific. And as I pointed out in our discussion earlier, this creates a new problem for us, a novel one, which is the very people we need most to speak without us doubting their credibility have all indicted their credibility simultaneously. That really couldn't be a more dangerous circumstance. So hopefully we can learn that lesson. As painful as it is, let's learn it and never let that happen again.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Next person says, in honor of the mighty pangolin. I must say, pangolins, I hate that they were implicated in this story. I'm a big fan of this creature. So yes, the mighty pangolin, it's a shame. But do realize, for anybody who's thinking that pangolins and bats are grotesque, that these viruses are parasitizing them the same way they are parasitizing us. So the bats and the pangolins are on our side, right? They didn't do this to us. Okay.
Delicious too.
That's a terrible joke.
Sorry.
Yep.
Sorry.
Terrible. Actually, I had an advisor, a guy named Charles Handley, who was one of the great bat biologists. Was the Smithsonian curator of mammals, and he, at one point after the Vietnam War, I think, tried to convince the military that they should equip fighter jets with mist nets so that if somebody crashed in a jungle that they could feed themselves on bats. And in order to test that hypothesis, or the hypothesis that that was a viable way to survive, he lived for a month that way. And when I asked him how the bats were, he looked at me with no humor in his eyes and said, crunchy. So anyway, that also tells you something, because, I mean, the bats he would have been eating were New World bats. I'm not sure that they're harboring large numbers of coronaviruses, but certainly this concern wasn't on anybody's mind when he did that work. So that tells you that there are dangers hidden in plain sight. Okay, next question. I'm struggling to understand what you're talking about. I am so interested, and I want to learn more. Thank you. I highlighted this one because I thought it was worth giving a kind of one-paragraph summary of what you and I are on about here, why this is a focus, why it matters. Do you want to take a crack at it, or do you want me to?
Please, go ahead.
So I would say we have a pandemic. It's creating a tremendous amount of harm. There's the harm it's doing, and there's the harm that we are doing to ourselves in an effort to stop it. The origin of that pandemic is of tremendous importance because, one, it may contain lessons about how we ended up here that will allow us to prevent this from happening in the future, whether those lessons are about a human behavior like eating bushmeat that causes us to come in contact with zoonotic viruses, or whether it's about gain-of-function research in the lab. It is important that we figure out what we did wrong so that we stop doing it and this doesn't happen again. Second thing is that to the extent that one finds the scientific community rallying around a point, expressing a consensus that is similar to what you would hear around the question of, does the Earth orbit the sun, or does HIV cause AIDS, or any one of a number of secure hypotheses. When you hear that kind of resolute consensus, and then you look at the data,
Oh
and you look
my
at the
God.
analysis, and the analysis falls apart, and the data suggest a hypothesis is viable that has been
Check,
eliminated from
check,
the table.
Check.
It
check.
suggests that you have a whole different vulnerability, and that vulnerability is in
I
the
think-
way your scientific
I think-
apparatus functions. And we are so dependent
we should be good
on
now.
our scientific apparatus being above politics and above the market and in a position to tell us when we are putting ourselves in danger, that even just simply detecting that scientists are reaching a consensus
Yeah.
that is not justified
I
and
have
spreading
another
it as
mix
if it
that's
were,
going-
that is in and of itself a problem. So hear me very clearly.
This should be better now.
Even if it turns out that this virus
This
jumped
should
from
be
the wild
better.
and got into the human population, evolved the ability to jump from one person to the next and spread across the globe, and the implication of a lab leak is false.
Jocko Willing and Joe
Even if
Rogan.
that turns out to be the case, the consensus that scientists reached was not justified. Even if they turn out to have been right, the consensus and their certainty around it was not justified, and that is in and of itself an existential
How
threat,
about I
because
do
we
this?
need
Let's
the
see,
natural
let's see, let's
disagreement between scientists
Check,
to tell
check,
us
check.
what possibilities surround
a
us.
little bit
We
too
don't need
much.
false consensus. We need frankness, and that's a tough lesson, but I
about
think it's an
this?
important one to remember.
Oh my God, that was
Anything
too
to add?
much.
No, excellent point. Again, I'm taking
Check,
note on your
check,
elements.
check. This is me speaking normally.
All right, so let's
we
see.
should
Next
be good.
one. This person just a
Okay.
comment. They say a chimera virus sounds scary. Downloading a virus.
I should
is
be
scary.
better now. But now I
would certainly
also
agree. The ability
what
to
I did,
download
I
a sequence that we know is
amplified the
infectious,
sound coming
and
into
then effectively leave it on the honor
a
system
mixer,
that
so
no
I
one will
should
release
bring
it.
that
That's a
down a little
terrifying
bit.
level of power.
Because that's going to Discord. And it's
Right.
going to blow
So
someone's
They
ear.
imply
ears
downloading,
off.
like being able to print DNA from a computer sequence
that
and
should be
create
fine.
a live virus out of that.
Yep.
Someone
I
joined.
think they're going from what you said that you
so I
could
test it.
you could get these things
But
printed
whatever.
at a lot of different locations. You said something about there being places in China that would do it very cheaply.
Here.
Right. I mean, it's
okay.
definitely printing
See if we're not.
DNA or protein is very cheap, but it's not.
Come on,
It's
switch.
not like anybody could do it. You actually need a virology lab, and you have to.
Sometimes the
those
game
pieces
gets.
together
Okay.
and put it in live culture. I mean, you could do it in a home lab and a garage lab. Don't get me wrong. It doesn't require all that different a setup from just a garage. Do it yourself facility. But hopefully, if you're ordering virus parts online or through any kind of provider, there is some kind of screening process that sets off alarm bells, and you wouldn't be able to buy a terrorist wouldn't be able to do it without anybody, any kind of authority that tracking that down. But state actors, yeah, you could do it very easily, very quickly. So, there's a scary possibility, and we
So are you suggesting that at the moment those checks exist so that only a state level actor or something like it?
I know they exist in the States. I mean, yeah, you get flagged on the FBI and whoever list if you're ordering anything, large enough fragment of any particular known pathogen. I mean, you could probably try to circumvent that if you really tried, but I think especially after this pandemic, there's going to be very close watches. And usually the people printing this stuff, they kind of know. Have enough biology knowledge for people doing this.
Come on, I was already fucking hitting him.
This particular fragment. Anyway,
So fucking meaty.
on one level, it's already being kind of countered by various intelligence agencies, at least in the States. On the other hand, I think after this pandemic, as we alluded to in the original podcast, you might get like new entrants, new terrorists, like looking at this and realizing how easy it is and how wide.
Yep,
wide
that's
they
a
can have for,
that's a problem.
$100,000.
But
$100,000.
Yeah.
I hope not. I hope not.
if anyone's
Hoping not,
pretty
it
safe,
doesn't
right?
work. What
I mean,
works
no
is
one, no one's
recognizing
looking at
that
anything.
this danger is out
This,
there and
this,
figuring out how
does the intelligence
to make
even
it
work now?
inaccessible.
If there's pandemic,
Because, you know, the very
is there
nature
any
of
spying going on
terrorism
when there's a
happen.
pandemic?
People are not powerful
Digital
enough
spying,
to
I
cause a
guess,
change
but
that they
how
want
would you
to
know
cause for
someone's
whatever
going to the
reason,
lab?
So they seek some sort of power amplifier that functions through terror. And certainly the relatively low price point for a huge amount of havoc that we now know is possible is certain to be attractive. So that means we have to be much more sophisticated about preventing this because, sure, it's going to be out of reach for people who are small time enough, but people whose interests are not honorable exist at every scale, and we can't afford to have this in reach for those with significant power and resources. Okay, so next question is an interesting one. I've heard this one a number of times. Do you think
Gender
it's worth finding out what happened
politics.
in China, even if it
Thinking
has
about
tensions
this,
between
and
China and the U.S.
come on.
or the world? This could have big implications on trade and geopolitics, possibly even lead to wars or proxy wars. Thanks, Ben.
and
I'll
this
start here.
term,
I don't
gender
think we have a
politics,
choice.
as a subset
We
of
cannot
identity politics,
shield,
but just gender politics.
An
How would that
investigation
look like?
into the origins
Every
of
gender
a
gets their
phenomenon that's
own
obviously
party,
putting a
and
huge
they
fraction of the
so
world's
gender
well-being
democracy.
in jeopardy,
Gender-
irrespective of where it leads.
every
Yes, it
gender
is
gets their own
potentially
party,
going to lead to
and they vote
tensions between China and the U.S. and the
as
rest
though
of the world.
their
On
interests,
the
so
other
that
hand,
their
I think we
interests
were
are
very clear in our
represented.
initial discussion
But
that we don't really
obviously,
see this, if the lab leak hypothesis
you don't
is
get
correct,
a party for
we don't
industry
see
workers
this
in
as
that
the responsibility
system.
of China per se. This is the responsibility.
There's no, and
of
also
the
there's no
scientific community
intersection
that
of
decided that it was
trans,
safe and desirable to engage in gain-of-function research on
trans
bat-borne coronaviruses.
factory
And
worker
as
because there's no
terrible as the outcome
no category for
I
it.
believe if the lab leak hypothesis is true, as in the form that we think it might well be true, that is an honest error, a spectacular one, but the blame is not what this is about. So I am concerned that the Trump administration has sought, as much as it has opened the possibility that that the lab
Oh
leak
my God, I
hypothesis might be
overslept.
real, it has also politicized that claim and made it, frankly, much more difficult for those of us who wish to be careful about this, because it is seen, when one talks about this hypothesis, that they are on a political side, which is not the case. So I would advise us to solve the problem of geopolitical tensions by being clear about the fact that this is a matter of great interest for humanity's well-being, and that requires us to figure out what happened. It's not a matter of blame unless something truly...
how about both?
Perspective.
How about this both? How about this
this
both
was
blame
intentionally released
and you come
fire,
clean?
then that would change
I mean-
the dynamic quite a bit, because this would obviously be an act of...
Are we gonna
but
let China
assuming
behave
that's
like
not
a
what
child?
happened,
Like
um,
they're
let's-
only gonna tell the truth if
recognize that
there's
what
no
appears,
consequences. That's bullshit. Tell
possible
the
and
truth
likely here
and
is
suffer
an
the
honest
consequences.
scientific mistake
Maybe
of spectacular proportions, and it wouldn't be
the
first.
consequences are not that bad. But you
Right, absolutely.
can't know
For
this
example, there's
for the
this
confession to be
77 flu
true.
pandemic, H1N1, which I think the modern scientific consensus agrees now that it was a lab leak from China, who have been working on some sort of vaccine for that strain, which actually at that time was already extinct. I think it's the same strain that was the Spanish flu strain, and maybe they were, or just in case it returns, trying to create a vaccine, which actually escaped the lab and started an outbreak first in China and then the Soviet Union around the same area. And for many years it was taboo in scientific circles to even contemplate the idea that this could have been caused by a lab leak, although there were hallmarks of temperature sensitivity of the
God.
viral strain, which is a hallmark of like vaccine attenuation. And eventually, I think many decades later, it was then recognized and acknowledged by the scientific community. Yeah, sorry, it was a lab leak. I think we might have just very similar situation here, whereas, you know, in the
Too
immediate
bad we've
future,
called a bunch of people crazy
barring
for
some,
suggesting it.
whistleblowers or unexpected evidence come out, if the status quo remains, nobody's going to acknowledge this was a lab leak if it was, or of course we're operating under the assumption that this is a lab leak. If later on we have evidence that, oh no, actually this was a natural outbreak, and we show evidence of these zoonotic animals for the intermediate carrier, then of course this question is off the table, and we'll just be proven wrong and kind of eat our time.
But we don't have
whatever.
that evidence.
But
wow.
if there was a lab leak, I think we're several years away, if not decades, of actually the scientific consensus acknowledging it, and the state, the government's acknowledging as well. But it is interesting, I think you allude to this, that the American government stopped forcing the issue a few months back, because they were pretty aggressive initially, and then they kind of just stopped talking about it. And maybe at that point they realized that it was a lab leak, but it was a leak of research paid for by American taxpayers, so and collaboration with American researchers. So it's not, it's not a very politically high dividend case to keep pushing. So maybe they dropped it. That's why they dropped the subject.
I'm thinking what has to be in the brain.
There's a recognition that a story.
I forget the game loaded
suddenly became so.
Because I was thinking about what has to be in the brain of a person
there
who
was a loss of enthusiasm on everybody's part for talking about it, which is
who doesn't want to
that we have to
even entertain the
hoping
hypothesis
is that somewhere out there in the virology community, there are people
there's
who
some
have
uncomfortable
the same sense that we do.
things
that
down the
story
line.
does not add up as a simple zoonotic jump.
if you accept the
It didn't
hypothesis
happen,
that
but
it
so
was
far we
that
don't have
the
enough
virus
pieces
was
to see
produced by
how it would
humans.
have. And lab leak would make good sense, and they're going to look at each other across the table and say, you know what, we actually have an obligation to say what we understand is true and why it suggests the map of probabilities that we see. That would be highly desirable. So hopefully they can hear how important it is that we need virologists to begin to rescue their credibility by telling us what we don't yet know about this story. Hopefully that will happen. I really do think it's possible. And I should say there are a few courageous people in virology who have very carefully indicated that this possibility is alive, and that's a very hopeful sign. So maybe we'll see more of that as people realize that this question is not going to go away until it's settled. All right. Thanks for doing this. It's unacceptable that the scientific community is so dismissive. Totally agree. DNA research has come a long way since I was reading black and gray rectangles on an X-ray film. You better believe it. I have to say I'm old enough, and I studied biology in college long enough ago that I have the same sense of it's amazing how far we've come. And I guess the other thing I would say on that point is these things the rate of change is not consistent. Fields get stuck, they don't make very interesting progress for long periods of time, and then suddenly they take a quantum leap. And so if you check back in haphazardly, sometimes you discover a field that was sleepy has made a ton of progress. And this is part of the reason that I said in our last discussion that I wanted a list of all the things that we're doing that are dangerous that I don't yet know we're up to, that I know I'm going to find out about after the accident has already happened. The list of times that this has occurred since 2008 is long, and I want to know what's going to be added to the list so we can address it ahead of time. That's really where we need to be. You have anything to add?
Just interested. Who left that comment? Must be a very old person. Maybe Watson, Dr. Watson himself.
It's
looked at the actual X-ray crystallography pictures.
Yeah, that is a long time. Yeah, that's right. It's X-ray crystallography here, not just Southern blot or something.
This guy knows his shit. for not being
Okay, I don't.
virologist.
Says I don't fully understand the ethical implications of gain-of-function tests. I've heard the concept discussed in a negative context a few times. Would love to see the Steelman case made for the positive in a future Q&A. I think we can easily Steelman the case for gain-of-function research. You want to do it?
Why don't you start?
Sure.
I was fucked anyway.
Gain-of-function research allows us to survey the capacity of viruses and to understand the harm they will do ahead of time without having to actually find these needles in a haystack out in nature. We can take things that are in the neighborhood, we can composite them, we can passage them, and we can therefore essentially see into a future that we would have to spend a tremendous amount more to discover in the wild. And that amount of power is potentially very protective for humans, and the only argument against it is that we cannot control the substances that we have enhanced from the possibility of escape. But of course, humans are very capable of doing remarkable things and figuring out how to prevent an infectious particle from getting out of a laboratory, while it is a difficult problem, is not an unsolvable problem. That would be the Steelman argument, I think. Now, the answer is actually that there is a related rates problem, and the more of these enhanced viruses we produce, the greater the chances that one will escape. And because the ingredient that you cannot eliminate from the mix is human beings, who at the moment are absolutely required in the laboratory to do the work, you cannot eliminate human error. And if you cannot eliminate human error, and people have to go home to sleep and to eat and do all the things that human beings
Brett, I
do
fucking love you,
off the
dude.
clock, you cannot prevent a leak. So it may be that the chances of creating a pandemic simply outstrip the chances of
No!
preventing one.
This fucking special killed me.
If
That
we're
was
going
so
to do
good.
this research. Now, I will say, as a final piece, I did suggest in a prior discussion that if you were going to insist on doing this research, and I'm not sure that we need to do this research, I think it may be the best defense may be limiting unnecessary and dangerous contact with wildlife. But if you're hell-bent on doing this research, then maybe you should be doing it on a ship, right? At sea, a ship
I mean, we had that
if
experiment.
something escapes, can be quarantined from the rest of the world so that we don't run into this problem.
Or on a
again.
tanker, but
And if
but
you
that's
think
the same
too much
problem as
hassle,
with
then I
like
think you haven't
separating
understood how much
older
danger we put
people
ourselves in.
from a younger population. At some point, people have to
I
eat,
actually like this
so they have to
because
meet other
there's
people,
already
and
more
so they can
institutions that
pass
go
the
on,
virus.
studies
It's
marine life,
it's
and you can do joint
decent. It's a little bit more secure than a lab in the city. Definitely, definitely a little more secure.
Decrease the
But
number of people willing to do this research.
how about you
yeah.
you
Nobody wants to be
pick
stuck
up
on
the
ship for a few months. But,
pick up
But
the
if the argument is that we have to do this research, then
the virus in a
we
lab,
have to pay
and you
somebody
go
to
to
live
a
on ship
wet
to do it.
market, and you
Sorry, didn't mean to.
and you
no,
infect
it's a good
everyone
point,
in the
but
wet
I don't
market.
know
How
if
is
I
that different
subscribe
than
to that
being
argument.
on
I
a
don't
ship
really
and then
see
doing
this logic
shopping
that
for the entire crew
we
for
are gaining,
food,
actually,
and then
this
infecting
shift
your
flexibility
fucking supply
is
chain?
fun, because we're trying to, I don't know what, predict a pandemic.
How is
by
that different?
Trying to
Your-
recreate in a lab
whoever's
one of the
delivering your
trillions of
goddamn
mutations that
food.
might or might not happen in nature.
No way.
And then
The vector's
and
gonna
then what?
always be there.
I don't know, like create a, as the Bionic Labs and other labs are trying to do, pan-coronavirus vaccine or therapeutic. Well, first of all, I don't know if the numbers are in our favor, because we can't obviously recreate all the mutations that might be possible in nature, and that might actually jump over into humans. And trying to do so, I think, creates higher risk of happening in a lab rather than actually being able to prevent it. by using this approach. And secondly, obviously, well, in this case, the gain-of-function research didn't help us come up with any pan-coronavirus vaccine or therapeutic in time, which I think they worked on 10 years, maybe more. So, and again, you probably don't even need gain-of-function research to work on a pan-coronavirus vaccine. You can just take the existing known strains.
But I still like Bret because he's trying to figure out something. He's trying to figure out.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all of what you've said, and I would add a couple things. One, if it turns out to be a lab leak, then we know that the very people who were telling us that we needed to educate ourselves about what an enhanced virus could and would do because that would be protective, when it came down to it, didn't tell us what they had learned. In other words, as I've been saying repeatedly, part of what may be going on.
But at least in the case with like a ship, it would be easier to track the virus afterwards. Because if you had the workers of a certain company that were sick. Although, what the fuck? It was the same case with the wet market. We knew the exact wet market, and we still had trouble tracking where it came from.
A waste. So that logic doesn't apply if this truly didn't come from a lab, but if it did, I think we have to look very carefully at it. The last thing I would say is, as a bat biologist, I worked for years with bats. I captured them, transmitters on them, I followed them around the forest, and at the time it was not well understood that there were these very dangerous viruses that we might be coming in close contact with. Now, the reason that I mention this is that I was not alone in doing this kind of work. There are tens of thousands of people studying wild creatures, handling them, and there is a famous instance of a fungus that is being transmitted to amphibians. The danger didn't go to humans, it went to amphibians through humans. But it is not the case that all of these people who are working on an indefinitely large number of species in the wild are constantly creating zoonotic pandemics. Could it happen? Sure. But I think what those who are arguing that we need gain-of-function research to address the possibility of a zoonotic jump are ignoring is that human contact with wildlife is very ancient and very widespread. We have lots of diseases that have jumped through agriculture, for example, but it may be much less dangerous having casual contact with animals in the wild than we are being led to believe. And the real protection probably comes from preventing intense contact, like the butchering of wild animals. The butchering of wild animals obviously exposes people to bodily fluids of these animals, and that is a very high likelihood of something jumping, which still doesn't make for a pandemic, because in general, if something jumps in such an instance, it will die out before it finds the magic, the evolutionary magic for transmitting between people. But, you know, we have HIV/AIDS, which we think came from a chimpanzee, probably one butchered in the bushmeat trade. So that's a major indication.
This guy is trying to checkmate me.
The amount of contact
all the time.
Already, the number of zoonotic jumps that have caused a pandemic.
I'm gonna go full ACAB
gain of function in
on their ass.
Is very low, if not zero. I don't know of a case. Maybe somebody knows, but I think we've been falsely led to the belief that the chances that casual contact will cause a pandemic is much higher than it actually is, and the research has been portrayed as much safer than it actually is.
Right. I think I know what we have in mind.
Okay. All right. We are at 1 hour. Let's get through some more of these questions. All right. Here's.
Sorry,
No, I'm not turning off super chats since
sure.
this whole stream was about clarifying questions about their original podcast.
These zoonotic jumps happen on a regular basis. I was using one of kind of flawed papers where they saw 6 farmers be infected, not infected, to carry antibodies for a particular strain of bat coronavirus, like 292 people, to justify this number that there's like 1 million to 7 million farmers in Southeast Asia who are exposed to these zoonotic jumps. But, and I think, yeah, that's really correct. And finally, I think, as we mentioned in the original broadcast, or as I mentioned, I think it's a much better way to spend the money spent on gain of function research, to spend it on tracing of various epidemic outbreaks that happen all across the world, to be able to very quickly identify such epidemics. And these days, the cost of full genomic sequencing, you could sequence a viral strain pretty cheaply and pretty quickly. It's so cheap now that
I managed to recover in the air.
So 10 years ago, you could have, taken a case that we need to be prepared. But these days, we can actually very quickly in real time find what exactly is causing a small outbreak, a big outbreak, and we can get genomic sequences.
Oh, come on!
The virus is making kind of a new appearance, or confirming that this is a new virus, it's a new outbreak, or this is the same seasonal coronavirus strain or influenza strain. Pretty quickly.
I lost the combo somehow.
Very distributed scale all across the world. And I think
somehow the time between my last hit on the cops and the door to the cell opening was longer. I don't know.
I think will give us much better outcome on gain of function research.
Yeah, I agree with that point, and I guess I would add a couple things. One, I think we need some better language. The idea that a zoonotic jump is a massive danger is really covering the fact that this is 2 steps. Zoonotic jumps probably do happen regularly. Zoonotic jumps that catch on, that after they have jumped, make the evolutionary discoveries that allow them to spread across a large population, that's probably very rare. And so, anyway, I think dividing those 2 things and figuring out actually, probabilistically, where is the place to prevent this? Right, would be a better investment. And then the other thing I would say, which this has just become
the bald man
clear in my mind, is that part of the problem is that we don't take normal, regular pathogens that we're familiar with nearly seriously enough, and that there's a lot we can do monitoring the circulation of pathogens and interfering with their ability to jump between people that we've only just begun discussing in the context of COVID-19. And so I would advocate that we got smarter about how not to transmit pathogens to each other, in the same way that hygiene greatly increased our resistance to things because we just figured out how they were spreading and figured out how to stop doing it. We now have technologies at our disposal that would allow us to prevent this from happening in all sorts of contexts where we are actually inflicting it on ourselves, like our HVAC systems, right? We could design HVAC systems that are excellent at clearing viruses from buildings. At the moment, lots of them just spread these things around buildings. So anyway, there's lots of room to make humanity safer and better that doesn't require this high wire act of gain of function research.
Yes, definitely agree.
All right, next question. Have you interviewed a virologist or other expert? And they suggest Alina Chan, perhaps, a couple other people. I would gladly have a virologist on. I'm a fan at a distance of Dr. Chan's work. I would say in the current environment, there is, I think, likely to be concern, even amongst people who are like-minded about what may have happened here, about talking to anyone who is being dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. And I've tried to be very careful. Conspiracy theorist is a stigma-inflicting term. This is a hypothesis. It functions like any other hypothesis. It's a question of whether or not the evidence supports the hypothesis or not, and eventually, hopefully, one hypothesis will turn out to be clearly.
Jesus, I need a Bret for like every political thing ever.
But
someone who cares.
I would welcome
to get to the truth.
I would have Yuri back on.
Who explores the hypotheses, the antithesis, whatever.
This is, in addition to being a very important scientific question, this is a dangerous question to people's careers, and people will have to decide for themselves whether or not they can afford to engage with people like Yuri and me, whether that's safe for them. And I hope that they can figure out how to make it safe, because, as we've been very clear about, this is a matter of global importance. Anything else to add?
No, I think he put out a pretty wide call to virologists who opposes the lab leak hypothesis to join your podcast and debate this freely on the podcast format that they see fit. I think it would be a very good thing for the community.
I agree. Okay, let's see. If the virus is mutating, why is it important to know its origin, and might it mutate enough that its origin may never be known? Well, I'd say with respect to the second, there's no reason that its current mutations, and mind you, it's not an it, it's many strains.
Let's try.
One of them could mutate so dramatically that it's, I don't know, conceivably hard to connect to other things, but given that we're tracking it, that won't happen without our awareness. But even so, we have samples from what it looked like very early in the pandemic. So there's no way it can hide. There's just a simple question of what the evidence is about what it is most closely associated with. And the fact that different components map to different origin populations is a conspicuous fact, not impossible to explain through a natural process, but difficult to explain, especially in light of the absence of any ecological connection between different hosts that would make it likely. So anyway, we're in a landscape that's actually...
It's not so important to continue the combo here, because there's a
I
secret
see nothing special about
right
this
there,
other than the fact that it is so...
I hope I don't lose a life. Oh my god. How do I not lose a life here?
I think you can maybe address the point of why it's...
I just fucked up, so...
Oh yeah.
Oh my god, I fucked up.
Yeah, and I think we've covered it here too. I mean, at the very least, preventing this from happening again is justification enough for chasing this all the way to the bottom.
Okay.
So, there it is. Okay. Somebody wants to know about the Gaia hypothesis. That's not directly relevant here. How connected are the Wuhan scientists to the global research community? Wouldn't other parties be aware of what they were working on from similar labs? Yuri, you want to take that?
Sure. Highly connected, probably as connected as it could be. There are two leading centers of coronavirology in the world. Wuhan is probably being one, and the other is Bret Lab at UNC. And they've been collaborating.
Oh shit, what if...
Closely.
Oh my god.
There was a
That's a scary...
I think almost every year. There was one in 2019.
That's a scary hypothesis.
Nice
if the information about the virus cannot be divulged because WHO has hands in the creation of this virus. Oh my god, like they were researching vaccines, but they fucked up and created a virus instead. What an embarrassment that would have been. Oh my god.
They have been doing and have awareness of things that have been unpublished or kind of the research direction they're planning to take many years down the road. And also the actual postdocs that work in one lab and switch into a different lab, they all know the internal kitchen. But I think there's a sort of like an internal scientific code that you don't kind of snitch on your supervisors and colleagues. So it's because it's. And
would it be an embarrassment worth
the whole field
the lives of a couple of million people?
It's going to take a huge hit financially.
Would it be an embarrassment?
If this is indeed
I guess it would.
So
if they're China is definitely like
to speak out, or even if they can suspect anything, they don't have anything to gain. This
what's
is
the
my
term?
understanding. Maybe I'm wrong. So maybe if you have a different view,
Consequentialist. China is consequentialist
Yeah.
about
No, I think
their country, so
I think people should look for
they're
themselves.
gonna lie to
and
you
You can just see what the coverage.
because maybe
of
something good is
Xi
gonna come out of
Jinping
that.
Is
On the
you know,
off
he's
chance.
given a TED talk.
Really.
These two labs
But
are
what if
connected.
WHO
Yuri
is
in
like
his
that too?
Medium
Like
article
they
does
would
a great job of
sacrifice
pointing
2
out
million,
what
3
the
million, or
friendly
whatever,
competition
how many
between these
million people
laboratories
died
look
now.
like.
from
But it's a very
corona.
small community. And actually, this
Just
goes to this next
so
question
They
on the
could
list. Why won't international virologists
keep operating
support an
for
investigation?
the better
Which I think is the same
health
question.
of humanity in the
sense,
future. Jesus.
I'm going to say something very nasty. I've seen it from the inside, and this is a major threat to our ability to think clearly about scientific matters. The problem is that scientists have been turned into salesmen. In order to get your research funded, you have to portray it in a light that it is very important and that you're in the best position to do it, and you end up saying a lot of things in order to get your grant funded that actually an objective analysis probably wouldn't support. And then you have these little networks of people. Most people cannot evaluate a grant by a virologist about gain-of-function research. The people who are doing the analysis of the claims are involved in the same work. So A, they're predisposed to see the work as similarly important, and B, little reciprocity networks develop, and so people are funding each other's grants and supporting their claims. And what it results in is science that is increasingly just disconnected from reality, where you can't tell whether or not something is really promising or is really dangerous because the people who are in the best position to tell you that have a conflict of interest. So what we're seeing is what happens when you don't protect science from conflicts of interest. The most important thing that a scientist can have is the ability to tell you what's actually going on, even when it isn't good for them to say so. That is a vital capacity, and we are destroying it by letting the market adjust the way science flows. The market is science, and it is turning our scientists into hucksters. And we got to cut it out. I mean, what has to happen in order for us to see the danger?
Yes, it's a great point for all of science, actually, not just virology, because there's this huge conflict of interest in this internal all boys club, being reciprocity, being in the center of these relationships. I submit a grant, you're going to be the reviewer for my grant, be nice to me, and then if your grant comes along, I'll be nice to you. And this kind of self-perpetuating decades of grant funding being spent on, and sometimes research that is not, basically it's done at a much slower pace than it could be, because it's just much more comfortable to do it slowly, because you're going to get the next grant and the next grant, and maybe you could have done it in maybe 1 or 2 studies. You are sometimes inclined to greatly spread out the research, you do it for 5 years and longer. So it's a much bigger issue than biology. It's the whole issue of scientific funding. It's a very good model at this point, but it's probably better than what was available decades and centuries prior. But still, I think it could be better to properly align the incentives for scientists to be still kind of on the cutting edge, to be honest, and to be not afraid to challenge the groupthink that sometimes is very present in some of these groups.
Absolutely. Okay, next question. Is it possible that the Chinese themselves did not know initially that it had leaked? You'd think they would have acted sooner. Now, my sense is I'm not sure what I would expect them to
probably
do, because you have to think about what these things
if
look
everything
like.
that these guys are saying is true,
Right? You get some
or even if half of it is true,
pneumonias. Maybe
it's likely
somebody
that
in a hospital thinks, is there
China
something
just
going on?
couldn't take the
Maybe
embarrassment.
3/4
And
of
if
the
you
time
actually,
somebody says, is there something going on?
China is much more
It
an
doesn't go
honor
any farther
culture
than
than
that, or it turns out to be
people
just an
think.
anomalous
They're not
cluster of
allowed to
cases
show
that are
weakness.
unrelated, right? And then, in order to test, so how often do you
And
want
that was
a doctor
even
who
before
thinks, am I
they
seeing
were
an unusual phenomenon here that could be an outbreak of something new. How often do you want
communist
that to trigger
dictatorship,
a search
a one-party
for a viral
state
particle that might be causing
They
it?
don't like
And
to
then
show weakness.
from there, let's say, okay, you've got a spate of pneumonias, and then you find a viral particle you haven't seen before. Are the two connected? That's a difficult piece of research to do right
And they're
there.
very
So
hierarchical.
I think the point is that
So when your boss tells
there
you
are so many
cover it up,
steps in
you
establishing
cover it
what's
up.
going on before you pull the emergency brake that you don't necessarily want every time some cluster of something emerges for the emergency brake on global travel to be pulled, for example, right? We set the bar somewhere else, because if we did that, then we'd be pulling the emergency brake all the time, and it would be for nothing. So I don't know what this looked like inside of China. I know that in retrospect and from the outside, it looks like they moved way too late. And I think there's a lot to hold them responsible for in that regard. But if you were in charge of building a system for figuring out, you know, when to pull the emergency brake and what to do next, I think you'd be able to recognize how complex a problem that actually is. And this is where being proactive and creating an environment in which things are less primed to spread would probably be a wiser investment. I'm very curious to hear what you think about that, Yuri.
I think I agree with most of the points from everything you said. Kind of back to the original question, I think it's very possible that, yes, the Chinese themselves, I mean, at some higher level of Chinese government themselves, they didn't realize what had happened, and maybe they were misled by kind of the local government, because we kind of know that the local Wuhan government was denying there was any kind of outbreak, and then the Beijing had to actually step in, and I think they actually removed some of the local leaders and reprimanded others. And initially, I think it was the idea of the local government to kind of quell down all the mention of a potential pneumonia outbreak. It was the local authorities who were, I think, targeting that Dr. Li, I think, the whistleblower, the initial person who kind of blew the whistle on pneumonias in WeChat, later actually succumbed to SARS-CoV-2. But then kind of the big federal government stepped in, and maybe kind of they were already painted in a corner where they couldn't really admit, even if there was a lab leak hypothesis, they couldn't admit that there was one because, you know, saving face or whatever. But they initially were, it's highly possible they were misled by local authorities. And the actions of the federal government kind of hint that they were extremely unhappy with the handling of what the local government did or the management of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, precisely because they instituted this Major General Chan as the head of the virology. She's a military virologist, and she overtook the leadership of the Wuhan Institute. I think that's a big red flag that kind of the government, the Beijing government, was very unhappy with what had gone on, or how it was handled in the lab. How
oh my God!
This work was handled, or how the outbreak was portrayed, or how data was shared with the world, or whatever. But obviously, the actions that they took, the Chinese federal government, I think they're indicative of the unhappiness. So yeah, I think we addressed this question.
Yep.
Of course, we don't know any potential deeper details, and time will tell. It's highly possible.
Yep. Boy, wouldn't a little bit of transparency be wonderful?
And even, yeah, and sorry, and like, not to belabor the point, but the thing that they didn't close Wuhan, they still allowed the Chinese New Year celebration to go on, even though it was, I think at that point, pretty clear that there's something bad going on. That's a big mistake, I think, for both the local and the federal government, which is probably costing a lot of lives. But, you know, hindsight's 2020.
Well, hindsight is apparently not 2020, because we're in the midst of making the very same mistake here in the U.S., where we have suddenly decided that some groups are creating a hazard of viral spread by protesting, and other groups are not, which is a very odd situation. So, as we
Yeah, I saw this kind of one California county saying that big gatherings are limited to 10 people unless it's a protest, then 100 is enough. Something like completely illogical like that.
well, it's even
But
it's even
protests
worse
are-
than that. It depends what you're protesting.
Oh my God.
And there's just no argument for this. So I agree. Obviously, a gathering of more than 10 people, if it's a protest, doesn't make it any safer. We don't know how safe it actually is because, as we've talked about before, it doesn't seem to spread outdoors. As I've
There's
also
almost no way
mentioned before,
to
I
extend the
predict that
combo
will
here.
change, and it will
It has to be in.
evolve to be better at spreading outdoors, so we should be very careful about things like large gatherings. But the political double standard in terms of who we're going to shame for protesting in the midst of a pandemic is it's kind of mind-blowing to see it. All right. What can we do to...
But yeah,
go ahead.
actually,
Go ahead.
sorry, in terms of maybe not learning the lessons, many countries are probably opening up too early, including Russia probably, who are, well, at least Moscow, because Russia is very heterogeneous in different places. Some places didn't have anybody sick, so they didn't have a quarantine. But Russia, I mean, Moscow had, I think it was like almost 300,000 people infected. But Moscow completely lifted all travel restrictions
Fuck
last
off.
week, and now they're actually opening up outdoor cafes and restaurants, and next week they're going to fully open all restaurants. And maybe it's a bit too early because we still get like
Fuck off!
infected in Moscow. Whereas you hear in Beijing, I think they had some traces of COVID, of SARS-2 in a fish market, and they're completely shutting down the whole city. So the kind of the difference in approach is very, I think, illustrative that maybe they're now the Chinese are taking it much more seriously than the rest of the world.
Yes, I agree with this. New Zealand seems to have cured its problem, providing a model for what we should have done. But the whole thing is just so incoherent that really, if you're going to open back up before the thing is stamped out or under control or you have a vaccine, the obvious thing that you need is ubiquitous, highly reliable testing so that we can just simply take those who are
Oh my God!
and eliminate them from a position to do it. And we aren't there. We have really cruddy testing. It's not widely available. And so anyway, I find the entire response so incoherent as to be just absolutely maddening. And we're playing with fire. We don't know what this thing is going to become. We don't even know what it is. We don't know that if it hides in some tissues and recurs, if you can get it multiple times, if it gives you lasting damage that knocks decades off your life. We don't know. So anyway, we're playing with fire.
Oh boy.
Okay. What can we do to create safe spaces necessary to be able to examine uncomfortable data? Not safety from offense, but safety from having your life destroyed for giving offense of making an error.
Oh my God.
This is what science is supposed to be. This is what science is supposed to be, and the fact that it isn't that tells you that we have a sickness that has no name. We have lost our greatest asset, which is a scientific apparatus that is capable of telling us what we need to know rather than what we want to hear. And I don't know how we create that in the current environment because market forces are so dominant and are subscribing to them as something like
try not to lose a life.
has caused us to turn something as important as science over to this thing that is incapable of managing it properly. But we must. If we are to navigate with the kind of power that is now at our disposal, we need a scientific community that is tolerant of all viable hypotheses, irrespective of what they might imply. Something to add? Okay.
Oh my God, the ads.
Yuri mentioned there was some sort of tag that could be used to detect if the Fern site was still present in a culture. Could you elaborate on how that mechanism works? Is it commonly used? Thanks.
boy, I can try. So, the way your inside is coded for in the nucleotide sequence, the two arginines are coded for these the codons that are recognized, like the sequence of the codon is recognized by what's called digestion enzymes, and there are dozens, if not hundreds of different digestion enzymes that are essentially the same as kind of furin is an enzyme for recognizing and cutting protein sequences. Digestion enzymes are enzymes that recognize a nucleotide sequence and cut it. And they're used for all sorts of recombination or whatever sorts of purposes that bacteria or other organisms have, invented them for. But for modern biology, genetic manipulation tools, we now kind of were able to use them for our purposes, which is you can slice in a given spot of a nucleotide sequence using a digestion enzyme. So there's a particular enzyme recognition sequence.
No!
Put that enzyme in at that particular spot, wherever you use it, you give it. And so this furin site has one particular recognition sequence that can be recognized by what is called the FAL1 restriction enzyme. And so if you use it as a
I think it might be A rank, but definitely not S rank.
R-flip method of screening is a restriction fragment length polymorphism. So basically the different length
Fucking
fragments
B.
that will show up
Bullshit.
on your
I needed to have a life there. I needed to not lose a life.
Experiment. Whereas, if you didn't have that enzyme site, you'd have a one long kind of stretch. But if you have it in your culture, it will be cut, so you have two short fragments. And so this is the different length, and that's the polymorphism that is used to be able to screen for presence or absence
How
of
much
this
do we have left?
cutting site. I hope I didn't.
20 minutes.
You're much better at explaining things than I am.
Well, let me.
As your commenters have pointed out, so maybe you can.
You're of course
We're
working
at
across
129.
a language barrier. You're obviously fluent, but English is not your first language. So, and this is tough material too. Let's put it this way. Let's say that you had.
Let's give it a few more shots. Why
Special
not?
kind of scissor that cut up a book only where it found a particular sequence of letters, and you could point it at any book and it would divide the book into all of the fragments between that series of letters wherever it shows up. So let's say you took the sequence of letters meta and you had every book cut up at every place that meta showed up in the text. Well, that would create a lot of fragments of arbitrary size. You could then separate those fragments from each other by doing something like running them up a gel, putting an electromagnetic force at one end of a gel, and then the fragments would migrate some distance. The bigger the fragment, the slower they would move, so that they would separate themselves out and you would get strata. You could look for a strata that had a target length sequence. So if there was a particular, you were trying to figure out whether or not you had a particular paragraph, right, whose length you knew because meta appears here and meta appears there. So you know what fragment you're looking for. You run these things out to get them to separate, and then you can see whether or not you have a fragment of the correct length. Right now, there's a lot of technical detail in how it is that you calibrate these things so you know what length you're actually looking at, but nonetheless, it can be done. And what that means then is if you introduce this site into a viral genome in order to, you're introducing the furin site for your own purposes, you want the furin site there to enhance transmissibility, then you've created, by adding this flanking sequence, you've created a target fragment that you can then search for and detect whether it is present or not. Is that about right, Yuri?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then you can screen for colonies for either the presence of this fragment or the absence of this fragment, depending on the purposes.
Yeah, so you can screen anything for a fragment that's this length, and then if you want to do further scrutinizing, you can actually take what was run to that place on the gel, and you can investigate further what's in it. But the quick and dirty test is just, is there a fragment of the right length?
Right, and the use of these fragments in biology was much more prevalent before, the full genome sequencing, or NGS, was much more cheap and available as it is right now. Whereas before, sequencing could take much longer, or you wouldn't be able to sequence as frequently because it was expensive. But using these kind of methods, like RFLIT, was just quick and dirty screening colonies.
That
and
slide.
Today, it's not as prevalent of using this method because you can pretty much sequence any colony you have.
You basically slipped out of the
can use as a very
of the
robust
group.
method for if you have a very large library and quick access to be able to tell if you got the right colony or the wrong colony. And it's definitely having that sequence in is definitely helpful. And it's just odd because the codons coding for this for the arginines. And
to be fair, I have to admit that this is the first time I have trouble following whatever video I'm watching while playing, because the amount of technical and scientific language in there is quite
so it's just odd to see, and it's
quite a lot.
Two exact.
But I watched the
codons.
first part of their actual interview, and it was fine. It was a good interview. I highly recommend it.
If it was man-made, it would make all the total sense. Of course, it could be just a coincidence.
So if I can sum this up, there are lots of little techniques that people who are skilled in the laboratory arts use to make their own work simpler, right? Just the same way a programmer would put in a little piece of code that would allow them to check whether some subroutine was doing what it was supposed to or something like that. There are lots of little tricks. You can put a little, you can add something that will cause a particle to fluoresce if it's present. And so then you can just, shine a particular light at a colony and see whether the thing is there. That sort of thing. These things are everywhere. These little techniques that just facilitate laboratory work. And so what Yuri is saying is that to code for arginine is common, but the way arginine is coded, the particular codon that is found in this particular sequence next to the furin site, is conspicuous in that it is absent from most coronaviruses. So for whatever reason, coronaviruses don't
Okay, I'm following.
Or not very regularly. And right at a site that we're talking about, how did this A, why is there a furin site? That's uncommon and conspicuous. B, why is it an insert rather than a series of mutations? And then C, why does it have a conspicuous sequence next to it that has a known use in the lab, and that
so it shouldn't have been an insert.
coded
Okay.
for in a way that
Or
does
should
not
have been an
suggest
insert.
a normal natural process.
I'm actually going to
in these
rewind that a
viruses
little
because
bit.
In general,
and
we don't see it.
listen
That's
to that.
3 pieces of evidence related to the furin site that don't. It's not the smoking gun related to the natural process in these viruses because in general we don't see it. That's 3 pieces of evidence sequence next to it that has a known ubiquitous sequence next to it. Don't produce it normally or not very regularly. And right at a site that we're talking about, how did this A, why is there a furin site? That's uncommon and conspicuous. B, why is it an insert rather than a series of mutations?
Okay,
and
got
C,
it.
why does it have this conspicuous
Insert and not a series of
sequence next
mutations.
to it that has a known use in the lab and that is coded for in a way that does not suggest a normal natural process in these viruses because in general we don't see it. That's 3 pieces of evidence related to the furin site that don't. It's not the smoking gun, but it's certainly conspicuous that somebody working in a lab facilitating their own work might have added this sequence in order to be able to cut at that exact location and done it in a way that fit their laboratory modality rather than some sort of natural process.
Yep, perfect summary.
All right, let's see. What do you think about the full of misinformation World Health Organization link under every video even mentioning the virus. I get the problem. You've got a lot of misinformation. You've got a lot of people spreading low-quality conspiracy hypotheses. On the other hand, Google doesn't know what a counterintuitive hypothesis that is important sounds like. It doesn't have an algorithm to figure it out. It doesn't have a team of biologists who are capable of sorting it out. And even if it did, that team of biologists is going to suffer from the same kind of perverse incentives that our virology community is suffering from. So in some sense, I think the only rational thing you want to do is leave it so that, yes, cruddy information can be presented. People are in a position to evaluate it themselves. But that means that the ideas that people want to shut down, but that are correct, are also allowed to get into the world. I just don't see an alternative system at this point. So I'm very much against these warnings because I think they basically are a wink that says, this is not a sanctioned idea, and this is not a sanctioned idea. Yes, we'll eliminate a lot of garbage, but it will also eliminate the stuff that the system doesn't want to hear. The true stuff that the system doesn't want to hear. Anything to add, Yuri?
No, I agree that, on one hand, you want to prevent misinformation, and I guess having this kind of generic warning is much better way than censorship. But, I guess there's no really like a win-win situation in this kind of emerging pandemic and a lot of unknown emerging knowledge that we still don't know the kind of the truth value of. So eventually everything will be sorted out, and we definitely shouldn't censor or prevent anybody from speaking. But on the other hand, maybe having some sort of warning that all of these ideas are still in the stage of unknown territory of their truth value.
Yep.
I'm kind of getting tired.
Next one. Given Dashik's paper posits a bat from Malaysia as possible source, what is the relationship between the Wuhan CDC, which collects bats, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which works on bat-borne viruses amongst others? I must say I don't totally understand the question. There are parts of it I get. Do you understand the question?
Well, I think I may. So I think there's two-part questions, really. Two-part question, because there is this recent preprint by Dashik and others, and maybe it's already a published paper, that did posit that it's probably the SARS-2 came from Malaysia because pangolins are found in Malaysia. But again, it's just a conjecture. We don't really have any solid evidence.
Should I try something else than the bottom left strat?
Claim. And the second part of the question is the relationship between the Wuhan CDC that was 600 meters from the Hunan seafood market and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, because there was this kind of original idea by the Chinese scientist, I think Xiao Botao, who published a preprint and thought that maybe it was someone working in the Wuhan CDC.
Neo-Marxist Jewish supremacist establishment.
Inadvertently released sample of bat coronavirus, maybe arthropod coronavirus, bat-related virus found in an arthropod.
That's a bit far. How about
or something?
How about you separate those claims into something that's actually true?
Investigating bat-borne ticks.
Neo-Marxist Jewish supremacists.
So he had,
that's a lot. That's a lot.
In some Chinese
and it also sounds like you're fed. Like you're look it up, yeah.
Bringing those live bats and ticks back into the Wuhan CDC to extract the samples, to extract the coronavirus.
You sound like a.
I think he boasted
what you sound is like. You're sounding like a neo-Marxist Jewish supremacist who's trying to poison the well and create a honeypot to suck in all the gullible people into like completely insane claims so you can have your Jewish supremacy. You're a fed.
This line of investigation of the Wuhan CDC being the possible origin of the lab leak, it kind of died down. and the Wuhan Institute of Virology took.
No, that's what I'm saying. That you're a psyop.
There is a very close-knit relationship actually between
No,
the
you.
institutions. Because first of all, there's many scientists that seem to have double
Oh my God, you're so funny.
They work in one and in the other, and sometimes they do work in the CDC, sometimes they do.
If there were blood-sucking, child-sacrificing Jews, if they existed, what you're doing is like the worst thing you could do to fight that, which means that you're actually helping them.
Would then kind of turn over to the Wuhan Institute of Virology for further work or analysis, whatever. So,
No,
and there's been a lot
I'm
of
an interdimensional psychic vampire robot. I do not work for
we're actually in
GDF.
the process of moving from that spot near the seafood market to
I work for
remote location.
aliens.
And they actually had, I think, a public tender up on their website back in September that they had a huge pile of.
I'd already told you, you're the
waste that
psyop.
they need to get
You're the
rid of,
psyop.
and
People,
and there was a
children are
fire
getting
that
raped and
got
trafficked,
later,
but you want your little LARP
won the
rather than, you know,
contract for clearing
realistic
toxic
claims.
waste. So this, but,
No, actually,
like
you've
too
been found
many
out. That's what I'm telling you.
very interesting things going on that I must admit I haven't been following very closely, but the Wuhan CDC and its connection to, first of all, the live animals being kept there, and second, to the arthropod vectors that Xi Zhengli actually tried to distance herself from when she was scrubbing her database in December 30th. There's a lot of like potential.
For what it's worth,
unanswered questions.
I think you're really, what you really are, you're a leftist who's
Because,
trying
you know,
to
ticks are
poison
found
the
in
well.
plants, and there's some kind
You're
of
not even a
tick,
Jew. Well, maybe you are a Jew,
outbreak in the past.
but you're probably just a leftist, just like a lefty LARPer,
And
mad
viruses
about
have
CHAZ.
been found to
Just
carry
come
coronavirus.
in, assume someone is right wing, just
Closely
dump
related
shit in their
viruses,
chat.
particularly by actually by this
Right.
person,
That's what you are.
Deigin Tao.
Yeah, you're red pilled. You're based in red pilled, buddy. Okay, okay.
The whole history of a whole host of viruses carried by ticks, bad-born ticks,
Oh my God.
and
No,
there was
negative.
another article
I'm
talking
neither
about
left
ticks.
nor
This
I
was
have
just
both
one
wings.
area of
I'm a-
research that I kinda
Because
gave
I'm a
up.
vampire, I have a bat form. I have both wings. Okay, okay. Oh, whoa, 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 whoa! Easy there, cowboy. You get banned for stuff like that.
Infected some lab animal and carried it out.
You can talk about you can LARP all you want in my chat, but don't tell people to kill themselves. I mean, I'm never gonna do that, but someone else might.
Yeah, I must say, ecologically, something like a tick is much more plausible to me than something like a pangolin. I mean, even
But you're
if it
funny.
was
You can stay.
a pangolin,
Just drop the
a
act.
tick that could transmit it between a bat and a pangolin would make more sense than some other mechanism. Am I right that the CDC does not do gain-of-function research?
I don't know.
I'm telling you again. What you're doing is actually killing kids that you claim to care for.
I haven't looked into it, and they actually
If it's all
scrubbed
true. If it's all true, you're very effectively shutting down any conversation about kids being raped.
CDC on Google Maps and Baidu and whatever. The one near to the
So you're preventing people, children from being rescued. So good job. Continue. I mean, it's all fun and games. We're joking here, but when you close down the chat, and you go back and you think about it, you know, I know you're gonna agree with me, and you're actually gonna feel bad. And you're gonna think, yeah, I'm actually against pedophilia more than I'm into this whatever LARPy shit that I'm doing. And you know how I know? I know this. I know this because I went through this. I went through all of that shit. I've done this. I've been there.
All right, we have just a few more here. Another argument for gain-of-function research is being certain that we really do understand how a virus becomes infectious and which things affect its infectivity. Yeah, that's certainly true.
I mean, we can do it retrospectively if we found a virus, for example.
Meanwhile, we have like two guys,
bat virus,
a Russian and a Jew, and a very courageous Jew in that, Bret.
But then actually,
Granted, he's an atheist, but nobody's perfect.
and try to make it infectious.
And they're
counterintuitive.
seriously examining a hypothesis that usually is a conspiracy theory. So, oh, there you go. He's gone. You didn't want to listen about like actual factual hypotheses that can be defended with facts. No. You want to poison the well. You want to run around and say the best way to discredit the Bret Weinstein here is just to run around and repeat 5G causes coronavirus. And that's how we never talk to each other.
You're right. The real danger is from increasing infectivity in humans or in human tissue in order to study the process, in order to prevent an infection of humans. There's an obvious hazard that's going to be almost impossible to get around unless you figure out a kill switch or something so that you can possibly escape.
Didn't make it.
Absent some component that you controlled.
Yeah, it's a good point because they do this in pseudoviruses, and there's actually been a lot of this kind of research where it's not like true gain-of-function research where you create a live virus with a, say, human receptor binding domain. You can do it in a pseudovirus where you put the receptor binding domain in a completely unrelated virus, which wouldn't be able to be viable in its own. I mean, it could infect human cells, and you can see it in a lab setting, but if it escapes, it wouldn't be able to propagate in a normal setting.
Yeah.
Why? I mean, it's limited, of course, because it's not a true virus. It's pseudovirus. But I think for research purposes, it's good enough that you don't need to really then go into exponentially more risk and actually generate a live virus that is more infectious in humans than it was originally in the original host.
Yep. The problem with a kill switch is, of course, it can evolve away, and the evolutionary pressure would be for it to evolve away. So you would have to build it very carefully so that the room for it to evolve away didn't exist. It has to really stop dead in its tracks at the point that you're not fueling it in order for that to work. But anyway, it's a theoretical possibility, and for all I know, it's happening in some way that I'm not aware of. But all right, let's see. Another argument. What is your opinion of Professor Michael Levitt's findings regarding how the response to COVID-19 should have and should be handled? Are you aware of this? Of what this is about? Yeah, I have a feeling shortly after we end the stream, I'm going to realize what this is about or run across it and kick myself for not having a good answer, but I don't.
I dropped the combo.
Right. What is your opinion on Kerry Mullis, the inventor of the PCR test, who passed in August 2019? I must say I didn't know that he had died, if that's what that means, stating that PCR tests should not be used to diagnose disease. See, questioning the HIV/AIDS hypothesis, 30 years of dissent. Do you have thoughts?
Well, I know that people have been drawing parallels between Kerry Mullis and Luc Montagnier, is that they're both Nobel laureates who have since started expressing questionable ideas. Other than that, I mean, I don't know, just because, that person has done good work previously doesn't mean they're right today, and well, conversely, just because, their opinion might be not popular or might not be supported by the kind of mainstream orthodoxy, doesn't mean they're wrong.
Yep.
Any hot water with other Nobel laureates, which have been mentioned today in our Q&A, but I won't. It's very, very, at this point, very dangerous territory to go into.
Yeah.
So I won't. In terms of the PCR being able to, that it shouldn't be used for.
God damn it!
Wrong, absolutely wrong. Why not? I mean, it's a great tool that have been used in many viruses to confirm that there's active viral or any other sort of infection.
He's so anemic.
I would say.
He's so quiet.
Kerry Mullis' case,
I can't.
Obviously.
And he's growing more and more quiet as the podcast goes. I mean, it's understandable, but
my sense is it might be that a certain amount of crazy combined with brilliance, combined with a whole hell of a lot of luck so you don't get killed off in the process of getting your credential, might make you more likely to make an important discovery
dashing.
like PCR.
Dashing right.
But then it might mean that you're more
Forget
likely
about that.
to come up with things that have an important kind of currency but aren't right. Like the idea that HIV is not the causal agent in AIDS. And this is what I concluded, and I think I said somewhere previously, that the thing about concluding that HIV doesn't cause AIDS is a syndrome. A syndrome is downstream of a failure in this case. Many things can cause that failure, and something that's sometimes causes
But this is only going to work if everyone is in front of me.
You're in a complex system. So we should actually expect that the two things that I think set Kary Mullis off in this case, one, that not everybody with HIV gets AIDS, and two, that not everybody with AIDS has detectable HIV, you would expect those things just by virtue of the fact that
About
the
the dash left
of something that could be triggered in multiple ways. So
I'm going to be on the left end of the screen faster.
Mechanism for investing
No, they're going to be faster. No, it really has to be bottom left corner first. Or let's top left.
Doesn't work. Not
let's top
because
left.
It isn't philosophically right, but because complex systems tend to falsify every hypothesis by virtue of the fact that there are lots of processes interfacing.
We had our best run.
I don't know how much farther to go with that. But I do think
it's not bad.
Well,
I'm kind of protected in the top left
guy
corner, but the same is
tremendously.
I don't know, but the same is true as bottom.
And
bottom
I
left,
think we have to
bottom
take
left.
seriously what he says, but it doesn't make him right. And in this case, I think he's wrong.
No way.
Okay. Last question. To avoid problems with kill switches, why not genetically engineer a super smart slave species that can conduct gain-of-function experimentation on unpopular human subjects? No lab
What the
leaks.
fuck?
Wow, that's a terrible suggestion. I'm sorry I read it out loud. I'm pretty sure it's a
someone
joke, but damn, if you're gonna
Someone
make a
watched
joke,
Alien
use an
recently,
emoji.
the Alien Covenant.
That's how we know, for sure.
Jesus.
Okay.
People have the worst ideas.
Yuri, is there anything you want to say in closing?
Not really. Just wanted to thank you for organizing these chats.
Let's engineer a disease that could kill us.
Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.
Like all of us.
You bring on more guests for much more.
Yeah, I hope they get on the
virology questions.
virology.
Explore this
check.
hypothesis from all angles, not necessarily from the angle that we explored. I mean, if maybe Anderson would want to come on to your podcast and defend why he thinks there's virtually zero chance of this being a lab leak, I think it would be a great debate.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah, that would create debate. That's
Thank
exactly
you,
what you want.
Appreciate
That's
your,
exactly
your work
what
and your
you want.
dedication to this question, and I hope we find out something interesting soon, and that would be a great excuse to have you back.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate the questions. Please like and subscribe. Pass this around
I
if you
mean,
thought
we're
it was
done
interesting,
anyway.
And
The
see you
podcast
next
is
time.
done. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna end the stream now, and then I'm gonna come back in like an hour or something for The Witcher 2, which I'm doing a playthrough. It's my first playthrough, but I'm going on the second hardest difficulty with like a save from the first game. So I have the true Witcher armor, the Raven armor, and I'm gonna be trying to play it as true to Geralt's character from the book. So technically it's gonna be a little bit political, but I think I'm gonna change the category for the stream. But that's gonna be in an hour and a half. And now let's see who we're gonna host. Let's see. Who's on? Who is on? Give me a second. I hate this new dashboard on Twitch. You have to click through everything. Host a channel. Jesus, and something is... Okay. Host a channel. There's nobody. Hampshire, I guess. Go watch some hamsters in underwater utopia. Follow this guy on Twitter. He has a pretty base Twitter. I love that guy. He's autistic and strange, and it's ethically weird to put hamsters underwater, but go watch him. He's a good time killer. There you go. There you go. Okay.